This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Neil Pasricha. He's the New York Times best-selling author of The Happiness Equation. His blog, 1,000 Awesome Things, which counts down one small pleasure at a time. For example, like a snow day, or bakery air, or finding money in your coat pocket. And he did this every single day for 1,000 straight days. An immensely popular blog led to an immensely popular TED appearance. For me, when I hear Neil talk, it seems like common sense. We should all know this. But in this busy, hectic world, often we don't pay attention. Neil brings great insights on finding happiness and staying positive. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Neil Pasricha. Millions of views of you speaking at a TED event, probably multiple TED events. There are over 1 million copies of books sold that you have written. I mean, that is, I feel in my little world, there's been over 100,000, but over 1 million, that's a big number. You're probably going to start doing more soon here with the release of your new work. And I imagine that these events, these are the secret. These are the source of your happiness, aren't they?
Well, in a way, they are, but in a lot of ways,
hold on, I'm being facetious.
Well, I was going to say, in a lot of ways, they're not. So, it's 2016 now. I'm 36 years old. As the books of awesome were coming out, I was 30, and then in my early 30s, and they hit the New York Times bestseller list. They got fixed number one on the international bestseller list for 2-3 years. The TED Talk came out. It as you said, took off. And everyone sort of looked at me at the time and said, man, your life's pretty good. Hey, how'd you do it? And also, it looks like you've lost weight. How'd you do that? What the secret was I was super stressed. I was sleeping 2, 3, 4 hours a night. I lost all the weight. There's pictures of me at the Webby Awards getting my, best blog in the world award. I'm rail thin because literally I lost 40 pounds from stress. It was the only time in my life I had such a big weight loss. I'm in all the newspapers as this Pied Piper of happiness. Therefore I can't really tell people that actually I'm finalizing a divorce and I'm selling my house. I'm moving to a bachelor apartment downtown in Toronto where I don't know anyone in my apartment building, but also in the city. Like I was a suburban married guy, imagine the shock when you get downtown and you're like, you want to meet for dinner at what time? I'm like, I'm like going to bed after Jeopardy kind of thing. You know what I mean? And so there was a black hole kind of in my pit, in the pit of my stomach. And these books were doing well on the outside and in my early 30s, but I wasn't doing well. And so the sort of, I'll do a real quick version of the next 3 or 4 years, but really it's I get back on my own 2 feet. I stop writing my blog. I mean, my blog, 1000awesomethings.com, was getting about 50,000 hits a day at its peak, and I stopped it because we hit number 1, and I just said, well, that'll be the end of that. I took this platform and essentially threw it out the window, which is not advisable, and I don't know if I would do that again, but I did that, and I didn't write another book for 3 or 4 years. Instead, I jumped on every online dating site I could. I tried to say yes to everything I could. I was ending up at very interesting talks and events and playing sports I hadn't even heard of before, and I was going out to every time anyone asked me to pay $50 to go to like a charity event. And, usually you kind of let those emails sort of pass. I was like, yes to every single one of them.
I'm getting tired hearing about you doing all these things.
Well, yeah, but my creative output was nil, right? Like I was producing, nothing. I was still working my full-time job at Walmart running the leadership development department, and my creative output was nil. Then I fell in love again. Okay. I met this woman. Her name is Leslie. She's a teacher in Toronto. I shifted my thinking really from the observation of awesome things, which is what I'm probably most known for, to the application of it. Like, how do you just live a good life? Like, how do you try desperately to cultivate the simplicity that a lot of the kind of 24-hour-a-day creative people, aspire towards. And certainly I was aspiring towards that. So I became healthier. I got more hours of sleep. I cooked dinner instead of eating out to the point where I had no dishes. As I was eating out every meal. And then Leslie and I get married. We jump on a plane. We go on a honeymoon, Southeast Asia. On the flight home, she's not feeling well on the plane. There's a layover in Malaysia. We hadn't been to Malaysia, but we had a layover. We look for a pharmacy. We're trying to find a place for her to lie down. We're just trying to steady her stomach, really, for this 12-hour flight home to Canada. So we get on the plane, 50,000 feet. She goes into the little bathroom. She comes back. And on the plane, she says to me, "I'm pregnant." Right away. Like having, in the honeymoon flight home. And we had to tell somebody, so we told the flight attendant, and she, scrawled congratulations on the back of a napkin and gave us like a muffin or something like that. I'm struck with all these thoughts. So when I get home, guess what? The creative juices start flowing again. Now I'm kind of 34, 35, and I have this new sudden urge to write down everything I can for my unborn child. That everything I can turned into a 300-page letter called 9 Secrets to Living a Happy Life to this unborn child. We didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. Leslie was 4 days late on having our baby. It was our son, Hudson, and I handed in the manuscript for that letter the day before. Penguin Publishing came back and said, "This actually is a business book. We're going to strip out a lot of the lovey-dovey stuff, but really it's something new." And that something new is the happiness equation. But that's my first book really in 4 years. And that's where it came from. It actually came from a different kind of pain, which was, me feeling kind of lonely and depressed and trying to find myself again.
You brought up the parallel between us right now, at least in terms of time frame. And I recently had a similar moment of inspiration where I really felt like the new work that I'm working on, I finally just saw it crystal clear. Talk about that feeling a little bit more though, because when you have that feeling, when you've been, you've done some creative work already, then maybe there's a little bit of a stall mode. You're thinking, when's the energy going to hit? When's the flow going to hit? When's it going to come back? And then when it hits, it's magic.
I totally agree with how you just put it. Those were beautiful words, Michael. I wish I could just bottle that up, because that you just described the feeling, and your output is staggeringly high with the amount of work you're producing right now with this podcast, of course, but everything else. Similarly, when I was in my peak, that was 2008 to 2012, my output was staggeringly high. I had a daily blog on 1000awesomethings.com, 3 books come out over that time period, 4 calendars, which, by the way, on those page-a-day calendars, you have to write the entry for every single day. I had a journal come out. I had an app come out. And I had a full-time job. I was working for the CEO of Walmart as his, chief of staff or special assistant role. And then I was working as the director of leadership development there. And so that was, the 40, 50-hour-a-week job kind of in the middle of all those days. That output was so high that when I hit a creative rut, it actually, at the beginning, the first phase was called relief. The first phase is just like, I can watch every TV show that people have been talking about for 5 years that I knew nothing about. I can catch up on what's ISIS? I never heard of it. You know what I mean? I was catching up to things I was just out of it. And then I actually started adopting a system which some folks online espouse. The biggest proponent that I've followed is Ryan Holiday, and this is called the note card system. And the idea is simply keep in your wallet some blank note cards throughout your day. That's it. You, me, everyone listening to this who's lucky enough to have the time, we're probably exposing ourselves to all kinds of different, quotes, interesting articles. You catch something on a billboard that's interesting. You look at the front of a Harper's magazine and a stat and the Harper's Index catches your eye. Whatever it was, I was just making a note over the next couple of years to just write those things down. Just write them on a note card. And then at home, I had a little box where I'd sort the note card organically. So I'd be like, new book idea? ? And keep a few note cards in there. Or on relationships, the good and the bad, things I'm definitely trying to figure out still. Put them in there. And then the new book idea gets split into 2. I'm like, oh, that could be a book about this, and this one could be a book about that. So when finally the inspiration hit again, through 3 years later, I had that note card system, those places, those studies, those things that caught my eye, and those were all starting points to do a new massive amount of research that I think accelerated the writing process.
I relate to that 100%. And what you're saying, and this is kind of a side direction, but for those people that imagine themselves writing a book and having maybe a similar success to you, but the idea that one sits down with no research, no collecting those little tidbits over the years and just keeping them locked away, and that you just sit down with a typewriter and just from your infinite wisdom and brilliance, you sit down and do one long 80,000 word manuscript, and that's how the book comes to be. And it doesn't work that way.
Oh my gosh, it so doesn't work the way. For me, I do still have the vision of, Ernest Hemingway doing that or something like that.
Right.
Although
but he might not have really done it that way either. That might have been the marketing that came after.
Well, yeah, and a lot of it is mythical. You're right. And part of what I think you're hinting at is actually something I address directly in the secret number 8 in my book. And this is called, I call it, the sort of secret first step you need to do to get anything done or to conquer any fear. And I share a story, Michael, about how throughout my life, I could never swim. I had tubes in my ears. I had ear infections. I was afraid of water. I had a traumatic experience as a kid. Like, I went up to the age of in my early 30s and I literally couldn't swim. And I'm not saying it in an embarrassing way because, many, if not most people in the world cannot swim. They're not near, water and all that stuff. But I was just sort of embarrassed about it, living in Canada on Lake Ontario and everyone, kind of going up to cottages and pools. I just sort of avoided the swimming. And I'm getting back to the writing process here because what happened was when Leslie told me on one of our first dates she liked swimming, without thinking about whether I could do it or whether I wanted to do it, I simply did it. I just signed up that night for $40 classes for the adult learn to swim, downtown Toronto, grimy, moldy pool, right in the city center. And I went there with my goggles and my life jacket and my kicking board and everything. And I realized quickly that we all sucked at swimming. No one was good at it. People from landlocked countries had more traumatic experiences than me. So within half an hour, I was like, well, I can kick on a board with a life jacket in the shallow end. And now after I did it, I thought I can do this and I want to do it. So the takeaway, of course, is placing a very small amount of action ahead of capability and ahead of motivation propels you. With we're sitting down writing 80,000 words example, you're right. You don't need to do that. But if you scratch a note card off your wallet, then you think you've started your book. Even if you haven't, where does that even go? But you think, you're like, well, I got 10 note cards on this already. And that feels good. That makes me feel like I want to do this. That makes me feel like I can do it. And I find that lesson, which is reversing motivation and action, it plays out in all kinds of places in my life. So rather than thinking I need to be motivated first and then write or then swim or then run, I just run to the corner. Then I think, okay, tomorrow I'm going to run 2 corners away, or then maybe I'll buy running shoes, and then maybe I'll get a good playlist. But the action precedes the motivation, which I think is the counterintuitive point.
You know what's great about that walking into fear is plenty of people out there will hear that type of story. They could hear someone else tell a similar story, and they will get the lesson because you're telling them the lesson. But they don't really feel the lesson. They think intellectually they understand the lesson. And I've seen this. Too many people will hear the idea of walking straight into your fear, just jumping into it. And they intellectually think, well, I just did that because I heard the story in my mind. But there's something different to going and experiencing it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I hear all the time, by the way, I'm on a stage and I do a talk about my book or whatever. Someone puts up their hand and they say, how do I write a book? It's exactly the advice we're talking about, which is just, you don't. You scratch out on a cue card one idea, or you write, I think Tim Ferriss calls it 2 ugly paragraphs a day, or maybe 2 ugly pages a day. That's his goal. And when you set the bar that low, you then hit your stride and feel good the next day. And one quick other story I'll just throw in here is a great story about Jerry Seinfeld, which you may have heard. It's kind of passed around on the internet. Originally appeared on Lifehacker, where the stand-up comedian bumped into Seinfeld backstage in New York in the late 80s before the TV show had really kind of hit its sort of peak. But but Seinfeld, of course, was still well known by this time as a great comedian. And this guy, Brad Isaac, actually asks Seinfeld and says, "Hey, Jerry, what do you got for me? Like, how can I be a better comedian?" And Jerry says, "Well, to be a better comedian, you need better jokes. And to get better jokes, you need to write every day. And you can't write every day because no one can do that. But the way to trick your brain into doing that is to actually buy a giant wall calendar with every single day of the year posted above your desk. And on any day where, you've cleaned your apartment, you've answered your letters, you've answered whatever, you just finally wrote one joke, make a big public red X on that day. Feel proud about that X, because then the next day you'll think, well, I did it yesterday. I want to keep that streak alive. And so this again is an example of Seinfeld placing action ahead of motivation. And on day 2 and 3, when you're struggling, you're like, well, I got a chain of 3 or 4 days now. I don't want to break it. So I better kind of crack into gear. And I certainly have told myself that I can do it. And
so many people hear that story. This is one of my notes I actually had for this conversation. And that's another great example of people will think they get it, but they'll say, well, I really don't need to do the calendar part and the red X. That's silly. I don't need to do that part.
Yeah, but that's of course the part that no one does. That's actually the part that you have to go to the store and buy a calendar and buy a marker and actually physically do it. And you feel silly doing that, right? You're like, I felt silly, by the way, going to the downtown Toronto pool as, in my early to mid 30s and learning how to swim. I didn't even tell my friends at work. I was embarrassed. People learn how to swim in Canada when they're 3, or 2. I'm 35 and I'm like, okay, the shallow, I was embarrassed about it, but just going there that first day made me realize, okay, well, I can kick in the shallow end, then I could kick in the deep end, then I could wear my life jacket in the deep end, then I could kind of maybe go underwater in the deep end. It just got a little bit more every time. The thrust and feeling of that made me so happy that I was looking forward to going to this lesson every week. I signed up actually for this Learn to Swim. It was called Learn to Swim 1, and they had 1, 2, and 3. I took Learn to Swim 1 3 times. I was just I just want to do that again. I just want to learn the front crawl again from the beginning, because I felt so intoxicated. I felt so high, off of the feeling of doing it.
Since I have so far taken you in assorted tangents, I would like to actually define from the beginning this newest work of yours. As you said, kind of going in the business book direction. And some of the key things we're really talking about here, overall, it's the happiness equation, but we're talking about contentment, freedom, happiness. And these things, something like happiness, and I would love for you to take off on a tangent on this, but something like happiness, so many people think, well, this is instinctive, or it's intuitive, or if I get the right job and I work the right amount of hours a week and I get the right wife, if I go to the right school, and when it's all done and I retire, and there's this happiness at the end of the rainbow thing that we're all supposed to be chasing, and it's going to be there when we get there. And that's really what you're tackling in this book in a very wide and deep way, isn't it?
It absolutely, and thank you. That was very kind of you to say it that way, and I appreciate it. The thing is, you do not want to be releasing a book with the word happiness in the title right now. As a society, we have happiness fatigue. It's the last word people want to hear. If you look on Google Trends, or even in just general Google, if you type in how to be, the drop down is happy. We want it more than anything else. And by the way, number 2, 3, and 4 is rich, pretty, and real estate agent. So people want to be a rich, pretty real estate agent pretty much almost as much as they want to be
real
happy.
Real estate agents? Oh my!
Yeah, I know. Real estate agents number 4. Unless people are houses are expensive. I want to get my cut. And I think model is number either 4 or 5 as well. Rich, pretty model who's a real estate agent. But like I said, you do not want to be releasing a book on happiness right now. If you go on Amazon, there's 75,000 books with the word happiness in the title. People are going to look for my book, if I'm lucky, and they won't even find it because there's so many books on happiness. But here's what I think was missing. I had these experiences, right? Working at Walmart for a decade, for 2 CEOs internally, as a result, having a chance to sort of fly around, be a fly on the wall in a lot of meetings. Plus, 5 years ago, at a young age, when my books came out and took off, I then started getting, crazy invitations to speak to the royal family in Abu Dhabi, and to be on the TED stage, as you pointed out, and go to GE and speak, with the dean of Harvard and the CEO at a really interesting conference. I was invited to all these places, and I got to see the fact that these people at these conferences, the attendees, the people kind of on stage, they were all like me. And what I mean, they were all struggling. They were all searching. They were all stressed. They were all looking for balance. They were all out of balance. They were all like, oh, but I got to get home because of this, and I'm working too much because of that. And
on paper, these are the top of the heap.
That's exactly it. I'm like, but you are a 7-time New York Times bestseller. You're the CEO of one of the world's biggest companies. You're, leading a nation. Whatever it was, these people I was bumping into, it struck me, Michael. I was like, wait a minute. You mean no one's got this? And then I went back into the research, and I found there's an incredible study done out of Hope College. It's the largest longitudinal study on happiness ever done. Since 1955, this professor has been asking people how happy are they every 5 years, and also charting income levels and all kinds of other indicators. And what he's found is from 1955 to today, okay, this is the largest longitudinal study ever done on happiness, to today, we are no happier. Like, the percent of people in our society who declares himself to be happy or very happy is flatlined. It's been flat since 1955. Yet, our income levels, our mobility levels, our technology levels, our access to food, our access to everything else has shot up. But happiness has stayed flat. So I have a belief that the reason there's 75,000 books, and it's the first thing you're looking for on Google, if you type how to be, it's like the first drop down, is because we still haven't found it yet. And my personal experience with these leaders and these sort of, industry leaders like artists and billionaires and so on was like, they haven't found it yet either. And then I'm thinking, I'm a dad. I gotta give something to my son where he has a chance to be happy in this crazy, twisted world. I went deep for the 9 months. I took everything I'd learned from my experiences, plus all the research I could find, and my own personal stories, and I feel that the happiness equation is an action book. If you look actually at the bottom of the copyright page, which I know you have the book there, is at the bottom, it says, "To my baby, I wanted you to have this in case I didn't have a chance to tell you, love, Dad." And I hid that little line, not on a page people would see, because I don't ever do dedications in my books, because I feel that they create a wall between the writer and the reader. That's my personal, just a weird Neil thing, but I don't have dedication pages. So I hid that in there because I was like, here's an action book. Here's actually tools. Here's the 2x2 matrix for thinking about your time. Here's how you prioritize your decisions. And the happiness equation is meant to give anybody the 9 weapons, 9 secrets they can use and put in their pocket and actually act on to let them have a chance to live a happier life.
I mean, I can really appreciate looking at what you've put together and say, well, this would have been really nice to understand at 22. Now I'm 47. It would have been nice. It would have been nice to understand, but sometimes you just don't find things condensed in a way that makes sense, and you end up living it yourself, and you come to these. So this is what I love to read a work like this, because I'm going to each page and I'm going, yeah, true. But let me say something though, big picture wise here. As we talk about this idea of people trying to find happiness, we could talk this topic today for hours. But I look at some of the traditional paths that we're all prescribed. For example, academia and places like Asia and India, it's even more pushing than America. The script goes something like this: study your rear end off, through the age of 22 or 26 or whatever, get the best grades, get the best job, work hours, and then retire. In this script, you're talking to a guy who put his first website up in 1996. I haven't worked for anybody since I was in a warehouse at 19 in Circuit City doing box stuffing or something. So but this script, this narrative, it's really, you give a great overview and a great, as you mentioned, action items to go in. But talk about this script that we're all on. Even young people today, I'll hear them talking, and people are still talking about taking out $250,000 worth of student loans and this and that. And I just sometimes want to shake people. And I feel like your book does shake people.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. There's 3 secrets in the book that relate to this topic. I'll do like a quickie on each of them. The first one, secret number 1, the first thing you have to do before you can be happy. It's 6 words. If you think about it, it's great work, then an arrow, big success, then an arrow, and then be happy. And as you pointed out, this is how we think about it. Study hard, get good grades, be happy. But my argument is if you flip those 6 words, if you be happy first, then an arrow, then you do great work, and then an arrow, and then you have a big success. Again, instead of great work, big success, be happy, it's be happy, great work, big success. Of course, there's been a meta-analysis study done by Professor Sonia Lyubomirsky out of Stanford University that shows that when you're happy first, your productivity goes up 31%, your sales rate goes up 37%, you're 3 times more creative, and this is one I love sharing with people, you're 40% more likely to get a promotion, in the next year. And so that's just a flip. It's like rather than doing a prescribed route, Michael, as you're saying, simply choosing to be happy. And of course, in the book, I give the takeaways of summarizing 300 studies down to 7, but there are things that you and your listeners will know, like writing down 5 gratitudes a week, journaling at the end of a day about a positive experience you had, a 10-minute meditation break, unplugging your phone after dinner. Like there's things like that. We've got the research behind them, of course. The second thing you're talking about, of course, is this concept of retirement. In secret number 4, I title it The Dream We All Have That Is Completely Wrong. I'm finding in early reads, Michael, this is becoming maybe the most controversial part of the book. I'm rubbing some people the wrong way, and that's okay. Because what are you rubbing? Nothing rubbed me wrong, so I'm curious, what are people saying they're being rubbed wrong about? Okay, I'll tell you exactly. So in secret number 4, the title is called The Dream We Have That Is the Dream We All Have That Is Completely Wrong. And I share the dream of retirement being completely wrong. The idea that you have freedom at age sort of 50, 60 to sort of sail into the sunset, play golf every day. Meanwhile, you live till you're 90. And I share the example that retirement actually was a new concept invented in 1889 in Germany when Chancellor Otto von Bismarck said, we got a youth unemployment issue here. How about at 65, which by the way was an arbitrary number. He's like, how about at 65 if you're not doing too well? Like if you're kind of, you're infirm, you can't do much work. We'll just kind of pay you to kind of come out of the workforce. First time ever in modern society that was decreed. The big difference, of course, was the average lifespan was 67. So he was really only paying people a couple years to bridge them from employment to death, really. Now we have this concept in our, in the Western world, which is retire as young as you can, do nothing for as long as you can, because you've earned it. You grinded it out for 30 years. And what I say in the book is, no, actually, you need to never retire. You don't actually want to do nothing or become idle or atrophy. You actually want to do what you love, which is exactly what you're saying. I share that the healthiest societies in the world, a great example being Okinawa, which is one of the blue zones, for those that know that big National Geographic study, where, by the way, more people live to over 100 years old there than anywhere else in the world. They don't even have a word for retirement. And so I spliced together a number of stories, anecdotes, and models to show the benefits of course, it doesn't have to be for money, but of continuously working. And I call those benefits the 4 S's, which we could go into or not, but they are social, structure, stimulation, and story. And that's what you get whenever you commit yourself to a higher level purpose.
That it's the challenge, right? I mean, who wants to be 95 years old sitting in a nursing home and having nothing left? I mean, we can, you want more than that. And there's no guarantee. Look, we could all go at any time, but there is a better process to follow. And I think you point out that having that constant challenge throughout the course of one's life is probably a better direction to pursue.
I completely agree. And when you first say this to people, like, oh yeah, never retire, they get very defensive, right? People are like, but I've been working towards that, and I'm a year away. Like, don't tell me I got to work 30 more years. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, as you pointed out, it's challenge, it's purpose, it's volunteering at the library or the hospital. You know, it's finding things that stimulate you. And I actually share a deeply personal example in the book of my own mother, who I got her permission, of course, to share the story. But, you know, my sister and I moved out of the house. My mom retires from her government job. My dad's still kind of motoring around town, you know, doing little deals here and there. And, you know, he's just active guy. And my mom falls into a huge rut. She gets into a great sort of thinking space for a while, but pretty soon, you know, weekdays and weekends kind of blur together. You don't have the existing social networks or work networks to fall back on in terms of your relationships, unless you were able to bridge those from your employment. She kind of swirled and swirled for a number of years until, you know, she eventually kind of picked up some of the accounting that she was doing before. She had a new granddaughter to take care of, courtesy of my sister, and she got better into a better state. But I remember those dark years well, and it came from retirement. And I even share an example of my high school guidance counselor, who everyone loved, and he loved working there. And we had mandatory retirement here in Canada, age 65, and he had a heart attack like the week after he retired, and he died. Like, it was like we just took away from him the thing he cared about. And so that's the danger of it. With the social fulfillment, with the structure of having, you know, something to go towards, the stimulation of learning something new or the challenge, and the story of doing something bigger than yourself. Like, I can't, you know, give people the world's information, but if I work for Wikipedia, I can. Those 4 S's create value in work and why you.
Let me bring up something that I think is really big in the news these days, especially when there's a big Powerball, and you actually see this across the world. The world's in love with lotteries. It's an awful invention for people that have paid attention. Frankly, it's a tax on the people that can least afford it. You know, a lot of people, there was research years ago, I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the people that played thought it was their best chance of getting $500,000 for the so-called mythical retirement. But I think your work really, if for as many people that play and want to believe in the lottery and have that lottery thinking, and I want you to talk a little bit more about how you explore the phraseology of lottery in your book, but lottery thinking it's prohibitive for progress.
Well, absolutely, right. You're putting all you're sort of gambling in a way, thinking that if I'm lucky enough to win, then I'll be good for life. 2 things there. One is I am in support of the concept of hope. You know what I mean? So the idea that for a couple bucks you can dream for a day, that's worth something. You know what I mean? That's worth something, I would say. But then what I'd say is, even if I won the lottery, or because you always hear the story like this group of steelworkers won the lottery and they all quit work the next day. Well, that second part, I think, is more detrimental to their quality of life than the first part is uplifting. There's been a very famous study, actually, directly on this topic, done by Professor Daniel Goleman at Harvard. I want to make sure I quote it correctly, but he quotes a study in his TED Talk about the happiness levels of lottery winners and paraplegics 1 year after. So 1 year after they either won the lottery or 1 year after they became a paraplegic, i.e. losing a limb in a car accident or what have you. You may not be surprised to hear that the net result of the study is that their happiness levels actually revert to where they were before. And frankly, in some cases, the lottery winners actually decline from their starting point, like where they were before they won the lottery, because they now have either extra carrying costs that they didn't anticipate, or more tense relationships, with family and friends, or whatever it is, or a lack of purpose, right? If they're not working.
I have to share with you, as you mentioned the wheelchair, you mentioned the paraplegic. I did an interview yesterday with a young lady. She was probably in her mid-20s, and she was in a wheelchair for a designer for a new book. And I have to tell you, that girl, the spark that she gave off was such that I just sat down in the first few minutes. I said, okay, look, let's just give this a couple months try. I'll commit to a couple months. Let's just try this. Because it was one of the better sparks that I've felt from a human being in a long time.
Yeah. I love that. That's amazing. And you know what? It's so it's so understandable hearing the results of the study because, of course, once you get past whatever major high or low happens to you, you're still yourself. And if you're investing in your happiness the way I propose, with some gratitudes, some journaling, some meditation, some exercise, things like that, then guess what? You can actually control your happiness set point quite a bit. In fact, you can control 4 times as much of your happiness as your genetic set point is. That's another study from Stanford. It's huge. And I totally agree.
You've got some great insights in your book about criticism. As a fellow author, and you've probably got less criticism than me because you've kind of been in these cool topics. I've gone into some really controversial financial topics, and there's usually 2 sides, like the Hatfields and the Coys fighting and, that kind of stuff. So I've dealt with my share of criticism, but I think you lay out some really strong foundations for dealing with criticism. And regardless of whether or not someone has written a book or not, these days with the internet and Facebook, at some point in time, everybody is going to be attacked for something, and usually nonsensical. But even a nonsensical attack can cause pretty fierce emotions inside.
Absolutely. And by the way, you may be right that you've been the brunt sort of more criticism. But if you want to see the criticism I've received, please feel free to visit my Wikipedia page, because it says right on there, it's like, Neil Pasricha is responsible, because I wrote the book of awesome, right? And I say awesome at the end of, popping bubble wrap and waking up and realizing it's Saturday and wearing warm underwear from out of the dryer and old dangerous playground equipment. I go on these little essays about awesome, and it's all positive. But of course, there's a huge essay saying Neil Pasricha is responsible for linguistic bleaching in our society and the sort of detriment of actually feeling real awe. And yes, those are, and they're not tongue in cheek. These are op-eds in the national newspaper, And on top of that, as with you simply have to, the way I look at it is you go on Amazon to read your reviews, you read the good ones on the days where you're not feeling too good and you want a little lift, okay? You read the bad ones on the days where you feel like your head's kind of too big and you want to learn about how you can be better. Believe me, like you, I've got my share of both. And on top of that, I personally became obsessed with my own numbers. So I share a story in Secret Number 2, which is do this and criticism can't touch you. And I share a story about how when I started writing 1000awesomethings.com, I was like, okay, that's pretty easy. I want to write 1,000 awesome things. That's my goal. But then within a few weeks, I noticed there's a blog counter on the side of my blog. Oh, I want to get 50,000 hits. Oh, I got 50,000 hits. Well, now I want 1 million. Then I want 10 million. Then I wanted a book. Then I wanted a bestseller. Then I wanted to be number 1. And then I just kept becoming obsessed to the point where I'm staying up really late trying to interact with journalists who might write an article about me or do something with a blogger who's going to do a post when my book comes out. Just extra, because I became obsessed with the numbers. The realization I had in bed one night, after sort of getting, say, one major award or something.
It never ends.
It never ends. I'm like, oh no, I even put this drawing in the book, which the publisher sort of said, you don't really need that drawing. I was like, I do, because that drawing is set goal at the top with an arrow pointing down to achieve goal, and then the arrow pointing back up to set goal. And it's a circle. It's an endless loop. You never stop. That's a scary feeling. That's actually, for all the high achievers listening to this, and I know there's a lot, it's like, that's a scary feeling. You're like, I'm actually never going to end.
Let me give a couple one-liners from your book as we kind of wind down. I want you to just comment on these, and you can quote the source. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. I've not seen that before. I should have seen it before. It's just, wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. I want less and less wants.
Yeah, it's exactly it though, right? I mean, if you aspire towards more and more and more, you'll never be happy. We live in a culture of more that even propagates that. You're surrounded by an additional something you can always work towards, but having a lower amount of wants is something to mentally play with and explore how little you could sort of live off of. And taking that cheaper vacation or driving that beat-up car or saying, I don't need to replace these pants because they still fit me, is an exploration mentally to sort of say, okay, you know what? I've just lowered my cost of living. Therefore, I need less. Therefore, I can play with my kids a bit more or make a longer dinner with my with my spouse. That, of course, is a Stoic principle from, I believe that quote's Epictetus, Stoic philosopher, and yeah, it's pretty profound, isn't it, when you hear it? I wish I could take credit for that, but I know I found that quote.
Here's another great one. This is apparently on the entrance to the I don't know if it's the center court at Wimbledon. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Boy, that's brilliantly written. You have to really sit there and look at that one, don't you?
Well, that one takes a while for your head to get wrapped around.
Yeah.
If you can meet triumph and disaster, i.e. when you're walking onto center court at Wimbledon to play in the finals against the best tennis player in the world for no pressure, $3 million with the royal family watching you and hundreds of million people watching around the world, the last thing you see, that's the way the court is designed. I actually got permission from Wimbledon and Rolex and the arts companies to use this photo. The last thing you see, it's a picture of Roger Federer walking out there, is if you can meet with triumph, like winning, and disaster, like losing, and treat those two imposters just the same. That's it. And it doesn't give credit there, but actually those two lines are from a poem by Rudyard Kipling written in 1895 to his son, famous English short story writer that was born in India. He ended up winning the Nobel Prize. And it's a 32-line poem, which I include in the book, about, having a life where you don't get too high on the highs and you don't get too low on the lows.
And that's Federer.
I guess it's kind of appropriate that the picture is of him, isn't it?
I mean, look, it's interesting, and this kind of a side note. But if you look at him and Nadal, Nadal is wins the French almost every year for a dozen years, but he doesn't have that consistency Federer has. He's more up and down. He's more volatile, and it really just depends in many ways. For those two guys, it's really a matter of what one has wanted for their life. But it really is admirable to look at the way in which Federer has constructed a career.
That's a great poem. And, you wonder, from the outside, like how much of that is personality and how much, like a set point, and how much of that is cultivated through whether that, I don't know, his personal, is that meditation? Is that a practice where after he loses, he does something? Does he journal after a loss or after a win in a way that sort of, restabilizes his mind about the high or the low? I don't know, but I know that those two lines are written above center court at Wimbledon. I was elated to discover that, because who even knows that that's written above center court at Wimbledon. And then I got permission to use the picture because it's pretty powerful. You've just spent your entire life getting up to this day, and you're reminded as you walk on, you're cool either way, buddy. Like, you got it good. You're okay. And that's a great feeling.
Here's another great one. Happy people don't have the best of everything. They make the best of everything. Happy people don't have the best of everything. They make the best of everything. I know it sounds just cliche-ish and trite, but damn, it's true.
So true. You can't control everything outside your life, your circumstances, your family status, all that stuff. Yet you can choose to consciously invest in your own happiness with some, by making the best of whatever situation you're presented with. Of course, it is more aspirational than achievable for a lot of us, including me, but I've written it down because we know, with the science behind it, what we can do to help us get there. And that's the biggest takeaway of all, right?
But Neil, the naysayer is saying, but it's circumstances, Neil. All the luck went your way. Everything happened right for you. Everything's gone wrong for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, the beautiful thing is actually the research from Sonia Levimarsky and the How of Happiness shows that, think of 100%. Okay, this 100% is your total happiness. We know that 10% is what's happening to you, okay? 40% is intentional actions. And 50% is, let's call it your genetic set point. Or, did you happen to have mental illness, or do you happen to have, parents that sort of pounded something into you at a young age, like mine did, about wonder and awe, because they were immigrants and they were in wonder and in awe, my whole childhood. But what did I just share with you in those numbers? Well, 10% is what happens to you. 40% is what intentional activities you do about it. So actually, it's 4 times more relevant. And there's a lot of science about that, but also I also include just some of the art, some of the Walt Whitman quotes and Shakespeare quotes and quotes from people like that. Keep facing forward and the shadows fall behind you. I mean, yes, you can say, oh, they're trite or they're cliche. actually the science backs them up. You know what I mean? They go together. Of course, there's a belief system required here. But even if you don't believe, I hope I've put enough in the book that will convince you. You know what I mean? Because I've written it to try to convince my son, if I'm not around in life and he's struggling or is finding himself in a tough place, I really have written this book, to try to be a way that he can snap himself out if I'm not here.
It's a little surprising, as you mentioned in the beginning, because you hear the happiness equation, you might be thinking just pure self-help. And I really think for the discriminating audience out there, they are going to find themselves having quite a few light bulb moments. And it's the title, The Happiness Equation: want nothing plus do anything equal have everything. And I wanted to read really quickly just a brief summary, and people will have to read the book to find out more. Be happy first. Do it for you. Remember the lottery. Never retire. Overvalue you. Create space. Just do it. Be you. Don't take advice. Even though you have been giving advice on this
preceding 300 pages. Yeah. And in the last secret, I'm just trying to remind the reader that it ultimately is up to them, because every cliche or every piece of advice we hear has an exact opposite. But I've given you everything to make your own informed decision.
Neil, it was a pleasure having you on. I appreciate it.
So great being here, Michael. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much for having me, and congrats on all your success.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.